Hey everybody, it's your professor here. Time for another chapter. This week we're looking at some of the individuals that came after Freud who really were quite as influential as he was. Although they sort of started in his school of thought, they started working under him and ultimately sort of branched off because of some of the concerns that they had, which really sound very similar to what you guys were talking about on the discussion board last week as far as some of the things that you thought about Freudian theory that just seemed a little bit off to you, or the more that you think about it, you start to think, well, maybe there could be a different way. And so one thing to really understand here is that psychology does have a lot of roots in philosophy. I'm sure many of you guys know that, but the idea in philosophy, it really has to do with thinking deeply into certain ideas and sort of taking them in different directions and testing them out and trying them out. And so in this time, and certainly in any time, it doesn't seem too strange that if you have an individual who's putting forth one particular theory, that other people wouldn't discuss it and think about it and talk about it and then sort of come up with their own interpretations. And that certainly was the case for the next two individuals that we're going to be studying, who again are very, very influential and you're going to be studying a lot of throughout your psychology career. So just for the sake of this class, I'm going to try to keep things focused to the personality aspect. And certainly you guys will be reading the chapter and sort of understand, the basic tenets of their theories. But just to give you a little bit of an idea too of why we're looking into this stuff, many of these ideas that come from these two gentlemen, Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, are still very, very widely used today. I know that we've said certainly psychodynamic theory, that sort of Freudian theory, is very much used today by a lot of people in a very sort of different and evolved way. But a lot of these ideas that come from the folks after Freud are still very, very much in practice and are still looked at and thought about. So I will be pointing that out to you guys, specifically what parts we really do talk a lot about today as we go on. So the first person that we're going to talk about is Carl Jung, and this was someone who Freud actually held very near and dear to him. He was hoping that Carl Jung would actually carry on his legacy, after he was gone. And as it turned out, they ended up really differing on some major points. In particular, many of the ones that you guys touched on in the discussion board, which is Freud's real focus on the sexual conflicts as being the root of all of the issues and problems that we have. Carl Jung was a little more of what you would call a new agey guy. He definitely was thinking much more on a philosophical level, even sometimes on a supernatural level. And in general, his idea or the goal of working with someone was to help them achieve a balance in all things, in the good, sort of parts of themselves and also the darker parts of themselves, and to help them find their purpose overall. So your book does point out some similarities to that human centered focus that came later in the 1950s and 60s. But there are some really important terms that Carl Jung coined that we still do use today that I definitely want to discuss with you guys. Analytical psychology was his school of thought. That is something that people do still study today. There definitely are a lot of societies out there that still very much study, use, and follow the work of Carl Jung. So definitely a little different than Freud. There are four main archetypes that Carl Jung felt contributed to our personalities. And the first one was the persona, which is named after a Latin word meaning mask. Many of you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with the term persona. We've heard public persona. We know that a persona is sort of the mask that we wear publicly, how we carry ourselves. And in many cases, people will carry themselves very differently in public than they do necessarily inside. A very interesting therapy exercise that I saw once was actually at Karen Foundation. They take these like plastic craft store masks and they give people a lot of art supplies and things, and they have them decorate the inside of the mask as the way that they see themselves, and then they decorate the outside of the mask as the persona or the face that they put out to the world. So that's a really good way for you to sort of understand what we mean when we're talking about a persona. Of great, great importance were this idea of the anima and the animus. And basically, this is the idea that within all of us, we have this sort of feminine and masculine quality. We have each of these qualities to different extents, and certainly, whether we're female, we certainly are going to have some, quote, masculine traits and vice versa. So if you guys remember, one of the big things that probably got you a little heated about the Freudian theory was this idea that there's something wrong with us if we over-identify with another gender, so to speak. And so Carl Jung said, no, we all have a degree of each of these different things. And he was often heard speaking about, the other part of himself. And certainly this idea is really very, very prevalent in this theory. Healthy people should theoretically have a good balance of both traits. And you've heard in today's culture, we often will say that I'm in touch with my feminine side. For example, a guy might say that. And that's considered a good thing. And that is definitely, hearkening back to the work of Carl Jung when he's talking about the anima and the animus. The other piece of this is the shadow, and the shadow is that sort of dark part of ourselves, the things that are not necessarily socially acceptable, the things that we harbor deep within us, which are unconscious forces. They affect our relationships with other people, and the shadow archetype is really that part of ourselves that we need a little bit of, but at the same time, we don't ever want to lose control of. So, for example, the shadow, let's say competition, okay? Competition can be something that is needed, a little bit of it. So let's say that in my job role, I want to be a little bit competitive. I definitely want to make sure that I'm advancing and make sure that I'm putting my best foot forward in that sense. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I'm not stepping on other people to get there, or make sure that I'm not, doing things that are unethical, fighting with people to get ahead. You see the difference? So we do want to embrace a little piece of, that darker side and have a little bit of balance. We need a little bit of that sort of fire, so to speak, but at the same time, these also can be the things that ultimately could be problematic for us. I'm going to move on to Alfred Adler. I can't believe I've already been talking for 10 minutes, guys. Seriously, I feel like I could go on forever. But Alfred Adler really sort of stepped away from Carl Jung and Freud in the sense that rather than having this focus so much on our conscious and our unconscious and this sort of internal conflicts and balances, he really looked outside the individual to the structure of their sort of social environment, namely their family structure. He's most known really for this focus on the family structure, on the birth order, and that being a factor that really, really shaped people. And if anything, that probably is a little bit closer to the way that we look at the development of the personality today. It actually was Carl Jung who came up with this idea of inferiority complex, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. It's this idea that there are certain domains in which we feel really inferior, we feel less than, and that we sort of struggle or overcompensate to overcome that feeling. Adler grew up a very, very sickly young man, definitely the definition of inferiority complex. He really was very much unable to play sports like other, young children, to go to school and do well. So he really struggled with feeling not so good about himself. The main crux of his theory is this idea of striving for superiority. So everything really sort of focuses around an individual's feelings of inferiority that come from their environment and primarily from that family unit. So he definitely takes a look very much in depth at the significance of birth order. This is something that he's very, very famous for, the birth order thing. So I know many of you guys have heard this idea of middle child syndrome, or that sort of forgotten, child. He had some pretty strong opinions about personality traits that the oldest child would display, in his opinion, the youngest child, and then certainly the middle child as well. I want to give you an example of how something like birth order might be used today in the context of counseling. It's very, very common when I'm dealing with an individual that they will reveal to me that they were the oldest child. If anything, that's, I know there's a lot of focus on this middle child thing, but if anything, I often have people reveal to me that they were the oldest child in a family, particularly if the family had very difficult circumstances, like there were a lot of children. maybe finances were really, really tight. And so what I find a lot of times is that these individuals have a tendency to take a lot onto their plate. They tend to really have taken on sort of what we call parentified role in their life, meaning that even as a child, they really had a lot of responsibilities or felt that they had a lot of responsibilities for assisting the adults. And even as adults, they can sort of tend to take on a lot and not feel comfortable asking for help. I've had many, I'm thinking of just so many examples of individuals who, for example, I worked with a woman recently who had just experienced a very tragic loss several months earlier. Her daughter was addicted to heroin. She had been really trying very hard to help her get clean, and she came home and her daughter was dead. She works in a very, very demanding job where she takes a lot of verbal abuse. She had not taken any time really off of work. I think she took a week off work when this death occurred and was right back to work at this very demanding job. Like I said, being treated really poorly, and just was living but absolutely hating every minute of it. And she did mention to me, and actually I believe I asked her, because she was saying something about how her brothers and sisters were such a source of support, but then I just sort of got the feeling that she had possibly had that role with them where it was very difficult for her to accept their emotional support. And if anything, even in her very difficult time of need, she was thinking about being a support to them. So I remember asking her, were you the oldest child? And come to find out, yes, she was. And so she's always sort of felt the need to be strong no matter what, and that she, can't show any sort of weakness or emotion. So in that sense, it really is important. Also, when you're working in with an individual from a different culture, I think it's very, very important for you to ask about that type of situation, because I definitely have seen also that in many cultures, the oldest child, particularly sometimes the oldest son, will have a degree of responsibilities or a different sort of role that necessarily places them in a position of feeling a certain way. Like they can't necessarily show that weakness, or they have to take a lot on themselves that may be a little bit different than other people in that same exact family. So the big thing for Adler was looking at the dynamics of that family of origin. As you guys remember, it's different than family of procreation, which is the family that you ultimately create yourself. And that really is the very first stage on which our lives play out. So to me, it does make sense that a lot of these sort of issues that we have, the struggles that we have to overcome internally, can be set very much on that stage. All right, so I hope this was helpful for you guys, and I look forward to talking with you next week. Bye.